All right, welcome back everybody to our keynote today. I'm Mary Louise Kelly. I host All Things Considered on NPR. I'm a proud member of the Council on Foreign Relations and honored to be here today on stage with our keynote speaker, known to many of you, Secretary Ernest Moniz.
Even to you.
Yes, indeed. Known for his role at the Department of Energy, longtime faculty at MIT. I got to know you through your work at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, also founder of the Energy Futures Initiative Foundation, and worth noting that unlike many of us in the room, you not only approach these issues from a policy background and government, but as a scientist, as a nuclear physicist. So, welcome.
Thank you.
I think I will adjust where I was planning to start and just pick up with one of the threads that stood out to me from the session that we just heard. Start with a little bit of a gut check on one of the key conclusions of this initiative. How settled is it? To what degree is it contested that the world is on track to blow past the 2-degree centigrade target?
Well, thanks, Mary Louise. And also, let me just say, first of all, that I think the Council, Mike and Varun, picking up this climate realism is a welcome initiative. Of course, after it's executed, we'll come back and offer some comment. But I think it's very important. The idea of realism and pragmatism has not been a characteristic of a lot of the discussion. And in my view, that pertains as well to the question about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. Look, I do think that we are, unfortunately, we're certainly going beyond 1.5 degrees is not an issue. Going beyond 2, it looks pretty unlikely that we'll be able to stave that off as well. But, you know, I'd really like to go back and say that I think the focus on these numbers has been counterproductive. Because it's led, especially with something like 1.5 degrees that we've been hearing so often now, basically since the Paris COP, that it leads to lectures, and I won't name names, but lectures on what we need to do to avoid unreachable goals. It'd be much more sensible to talk about what we can do to achieve real progress. And frankly, so for example, like the 1.5 degree discussion, for example, I think it's been very, very negative with regard to how we in the industrialized world approach climate issues in the developing world, where, you know, the differentiation between how a rich country and a poor country can approach these issues is so different, and it kind of puts everybody into the same silo, and it doesn't work.
So before we go there to the developing world and developed world, is there a better metric? I mean, we heard a lot about it's hard for most people, probably most people in this room, to wrap their head around what a difference of a couple degrees or 5 degrees would mean. It's the difference between 70 and 75 degrees. Both sound within the realm of possibility. What's the better metric?
Well, I'm going to give an unsatisfactory non-soundbite. I mean, I think the real temperature goal is to fight like hell for every damn 1/10 of a degree. That's really what we have to do. Now,
it's not about soundbite, by the way.
Sorry?
Not about soundbite.
It's not? Oh, okay. Well, you're an expert, so I'm encouraged. But I do think that it's often ignored that there is a very strong feedback effect, that as the world warms, et cetera, extreme weather gets worse and worse and worse. It impacts people directly, like insurance or inability to insure, or I could tell you about the insurance request, the change of my cabin in the woods. It was not pleasant. That these things affect real people, and I think that's the feedback loop that in the end will control at some level the average global warming increase. I fear fully expect that to be beyond 2 degrees. But there's lots of feedback loops in terms of mitigation, adaptation. Going to hear about geoengineering later. Lots of things that we don't do now that I think we will feel more and more pressure to do in a kind of a self-regulating system. But unfortunately, we tend to have too much resilience to major change to make those changes fast enough.
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're talking about extreme weather affecting, where we live, our ability to get insurance. Is what you're saying, and one could see hope in this actually, that extreme weather will force our hand? We're not talking about life for our hypothetical great-grandchildren. We're talking about now, impacting us now.
Mary Louise, I think you put your finger right on it, that we do indeed love our grandchildren and children, but we love ourselves more. I think that has been evident by the lack of serious reaction for future generations, whereas getting hit in the pocketbook right now is moving the dial on public opinion. I hate to be so cynical, but I think it's just an observation of the facts. And I do think, and I have said it's overly one-dimensional, but I do think extreme weather is ultimately the tipping point will be the tipping point in the political willingness of populations to pressure the political leadership to make real change. But it's slow.
So I wasn't planning to get into politics quite so early, but we are gathered in Washington on yet another day when the U.S. appears to be turning away from, indeed actively working to upend the global world order as we have understood it for generations. I suspect that whatever one's politics in this room, we're all twitching to check our 401ks as this afternoon proceeds. On the climate front, since returning to office in January, Trump and his administration have slashed funding for clean energy. His administration is prioritizing the production of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, part of an agenda that he calls energy dominance. How big a reversal is that? How big a deal is it?
Well, it's a very big reversal, but I'll put it in a slightly different context. I think that we have collectively made a mistake in not viewing climate, clean energy, security, energy and national security, social equity, affordability as one conversation and not a set of siloed conversations.
An either or.
And yes.
An and.
Now, look, the reality is, if I take those four as an example, climate, security, equity, affordability, I would argue that the Biden administration chose to focus on two of those, climate and equity. This administration chooses to focus on two of those, security and affordability. And we're supposed to make some progress where we just lurch between choosing different conversations. So I think, and that's why I like the Climate Realism Initiative so far, in principle at least, that I think it leads naturally towards that more integrated conversation, recognizing you got to build coalitions who may have, stronger motivations along one or the other of those dimensions, but recognizing you got to, if you want to make progress on any of them, you've got to build the coalitions that are going to, I think, advance all of them. I'll give you an example, a non-U.S. example. I know I want to get away from your politics there.
I'll bring you back.
By the way, buy low, sell high is my advice on your 401k. But if you go back some years now to the Gilets jaunes in France, President Macron announced he was making a climate initiative. I think he's never recovered from that in terms of climate, because the equity component was not part of that same integrated discussion. And I think, you know, that we're just going to keep having headwinds in multiple dimensions if we try to get one tailwind in this strange metaphor that I tried. The other thing also, Mary Louise, you mentioned energy dominance, a term that I still choke over when I try to say it. But I think there's the idea of singling out oil and gas is a very, very fundamental mistake in the context of energy dominance. So the fact that we are the #1 producer of oil in the world, the fact that we are the #1 producer of gas in the world, the fact that we are the #1 exporter of LNG, those are facts. And it's also a fact that those are going to be important parts of global markets for decades. However, it doesn't help to put your head in the sand and not recognize that clean energy markets are going to be dominant global markets for decades. Well, if you want to decide to say, okay, I'm going to be dominant in one part of the market for a country as big as the United States with the largest economy in the world, still the largest internal market, I don't get that. Why wouldn't I be trying to emphasize across the board being a leader, I'm not going to use the word dominant, but at least a leadership role across the board? And secondly, I would welcome anyone to educate me, because I cannot think of a single case in which the United States has a major export market, major position in a global market without having a very strong domestic market as the foundation. Why? And so therefore, I think the current mantra is counterproductive to its own goal of having leadership across the energy markets.
I was going to ask, why do you choke on the phrase energy dominance?
Well, dominance is not exactly a great coalition-building word, and I think we need coalitions. We certainly need our allies and friends. Look, on the security side, for example, as I mentioned, it's not only about climate, it's climate, security, equity, affordability. On the security side, in 2014, when I was secretary at the time, that's when the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. It wasn't 2022, it was 2014. Immediately after that, Dan, you were still deputy secretary at that time, but I didn't blame you for it. Immediately after that, the United States took a leadership role with the G7 and the EU to take kind of a modern view of energy security. And the chapeau of the entire initiative was energy security is a collective responsibility among allies and friends. That's why I don't like the word dominance. Now, furthermore, I just add, if I may, just one word on
Please.
China as well. Look, the reality is, and Varun has said this, the reality is that when it comes to the clean energy space, by choice, China has become the leader. Does that have to be true forever? No. But it's going to be true forever unless we take a proactive stance, frankly, use words that until recently were not allowed in polite company, industrial policy. Now we call it industrial strategy. I mean, we're going to have a coherent effort if we want to be a major player in those markets with China.
To try to pin you down a little bit on this, because it does strike me we are having a fundamentally different conversation than we might have on this stage a year ago in terms of what is realistic, particularly regarding U.S. policy. So I want to put to you a couple of things. Your successor as Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who also calls himself a climate realist, by the way, does not deny that the planet is warming. A couple of things he said in Houston last month at a big conference. He argued that everything involves trade-offs. And he was talking about the global economy and good for the planet. Is he wrong? Are there not trade-offs in terms of what is good for the economy and what is good for the planet in this emerging transition to clean energy, if that is in fact where we're going?
I think he is certainly correct that there are trade-offs, if you want to use that term. That's what I mean by having one conversation around climate, security, equity, affordability. However, I don't think his prescriptions are particularly on the mark. And for example, one thing that he said, and the CFR Climate Realism also said, I believe incorrectly, is that the United States emissions, quotes, don't matter because they are becoming so small. Every individual country's emissions are not going to be, a majority of global emissions. But the idea that a country of our wealth would not be part of the leadership and taking advantage of that leadership, frankly, in terms of the energy market discussion we had earlier, I think is fundamentally incorrect. So if
on
Chris
that point,
Wright,
if I may just
yeah.
interject, I believe the initiative didn't say what the U.S. does doesn't matter, but that it's increasingly irrelevant shaping the future of the planet because emissions from China, India are so much bigger.
And I accept your rephrasing and draw the same conclusion. It does matter. It does, whatever it is, reshape or whatever, however you phrase it nicely. But I think, again, Chris Wright, Chris, first of all, I do think the media have not done the best job in terms of characterizing where Chris Wright comes from, because he has a direct history, in addition to obviously making a lot of money fracking. He has a direct history in solar, in geothermal, in nuclear energy. So I think he does share a broader, nearly all of the above, if not quite all of the above, approach. But on the other hand, I don't think, and by the way, also another thing that I really appreciate, Chris has been very, very strong for a long time in terms of things like the importance of clean cooking. So addressing some of these equity issues has always been part of his agenda. Clearly, security is part of his agenda. He's kind of narrowed the field in terms of some of the energy options, I think, in a way that is not helpful to the goal of market leadership globally.
Yeah. Do you know him?
I don't really know him well. I've met him, but I don't really know him well.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I'm going to throw in one more, and then I want to open it to the room for questions. This is it's a bigger question than climate. It applies to all U.S. foreign policy. But as we talk about what this administration is doing and how they may be approaching things differently from Biden and from Trump before that and Obama before that, is there any way, because climate is so long-term, and the results you can't undo, is there any way to insulate climate from the pendulum of U.S. domestic politics, where one administration comes in and signs on to the Paris Accord, and then the next one comes in and unjoins, and then we go here, there, and back and forth?
Well, first of all, let me answer a slightly different question, and then answer your question. It's related in the sense that if you go back to President Trump's first term, I think one would be challenged to find a lot of deviation in the carbon emissions trajectory from his policies. I mean, frankly, withdrawing from Paris did not result in a change in the trajectory. Second time around, it may have more of an impact, actually. But I think if you go back to that first term, there were at least 3 stabilizing factors, I would say. One, of course, is the states and major cities, also in red states, were very aggressive in terms of renewable portfolio standards and the like. Secondly,
So local initiatives, state,
So
local.
local, regional initiatives, and those are very, very important. For one thing, because the regional ways of successfully approaching the climate challenge are very, very different within our country and certainly in different parts of the world. And that was another part of our manifesto back in 2019 when we published the guiding principles we felt for addressing climate successfully. One was recognizing regional differences. Another was building coalitions, as we discussed. I think that those regional efforts were very important. A second element was the private sector did not really deviate from where it was going. In the energy business, large-scale capital allocations don't have a 4-year time horizon. They have a couple of decades at least time horizon, and the companies stayed the course. We can argue whether it was enough, fast enough, et cetera, but I think they basically stayed the course. Third element was that Congress, despite all of the rhetoric, when it came to things like the innovation agenda, the innovation budget, people forget that every year the administration budget proposed a huge cut in all the energy programs, and every year the Congress overrode that. Now, that's not to say all three factors are going to play in the same way now. I think the first will, to a large extent, even though there are pressures against some of the regional initiatives. I think the private sector is a little bit intimidated and may not be quite as aggressive as they were. And third, I think the congressional stabilization probably will not be there. And the reason it will not be there, in my view, is less ideological and more just plain fiscal pressure. I remind you, in Trump 1.0, we did not have a deficit that was a third of the budget. We did not have a national debt that was a third larger than the GDP. And so there are some tricks, as we are seeing right now, in which magically the extension of tax cuts are no longer considered contribution to the deficit. Okay, fine, Congress can wave their magic wand and do that. It's not going to change the debt. The national debt isn't going to be changed by Congress doing something exactly counter to what it did previously in terms of its scoring. So scoring and reality should not be confused, and that's what's happening. So I'm afraid that I think that the stabilizing elements are going to be weaker this time around than they were in the first Trump administration.
Questions. As we did after the first panel, I would love for you to tell us briefly who you are, and if you could actually make your question a question, that would be much appreciated. I saw a hand back here in the middle of the room against the wall first. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you. Ramon Cruz used to head the Sierra Club, then until a year ago, and then Princeton University. I was wondering, well, Martin Luther King used to say to his lieutenants, if your coalition, if you're too comfortable in your coalition, then your coalition is too small. And so I agree with your point of view that, we need unlikely coalitions that are big enough to win. So I was wondering if you could go deeper into into your point and offer any advice, because, basically, can the Sierra Club and the American Petroleum Institute ever be, join, forces into a point, So can you go deeper into what are these coalitions that you think can make us win?
Well, quite relevant to the Sierra Club. So using that as a pivot point, as you kind of suggested, for example, we have a lot of polarization over vilifying incumbent energy companies. It accomplishes nothing. it sets us back. We have to, in my view, embrace the incumbent energy companies as part of the solution and help lead them to more aggressive solutions. The same way we have to embrace a lot of environmental groups that are not necessarily building coalitions effectively. In fact, often, to be blunt, fracturing coalitions. I'll give you one example. Just recently, there was a lot of Sturm und Drang over the 45V tax credits. Just to put everybody in the same stage here, 45V was the section of the IRA that gave tax credits for hydrogen development. And hydrogen is got a rough path of cost reduction, and yet it holds promise if to possibly be hugely important across the board. So, to be honest, and we wrote about this publicly, so I'm not saying anything that we didn't say publicly at the time, that the letter that was written by a number of environmental organizations together on 45V having what I consider to be a very narrow interpretation. To be honest, I called it anal retentive. That it would defeat the objective of building the hydrogen demand side while decarbonizing the electricity grid so that down the road we'd have the best of both worlds. And I think what's playing out is exactly as predicted. It's providing an enormous obstacle to hydrogen demand creation. Of course now and that's of course amplified dramatically by what is rumored to be the next step of the administration in probably undercutting a lot of those hydrogen hubs that were to build demand. So that's an example where there was a simple solution of a little give on both sides to follow our traditional methods. For example, we don't require the very strange requirements of 45V for hydrogen. We don't require that for electric vehicle charging. Why do we do it here? I mean, it's just, if there was a different mindset, I can bring the environmental groups, the energy groups, the NGOs together around a rule making. That rule would have gone through easily, because everybody, Congress, the administration, when they can get, quotes, opposites saying we agree on something, they just want to pocket it as quickly as possible and do that. I'll give you an example of what did happen. This is a different area, but as you know, when it comes to things like small hydro and rivers, et cetera, people in the energy business, people in the environmental business, people in the trout fishing business, et cetera, all have very, very different views. So one of my colleagues at DOE back in the Clinton years, Dan Riker, kind of was a principal leader in something called an uncommon dialogue, to put them all in the same room. And then they all went together to Congress and say, we can all live with this. You got to give us $2 billion. Congress said, done. Here's $2 billion because it took a big problem off the table. So, the reality is we may not get, everybody may not get quite everything they want. But if everybody has their own values embedded in a coalition, I just think we'll make much faster progress, in particular on the climate issue.
I'd seen one up front. Yes, Dan. Mic coming to you.
Thank you. Dan Poneman, Council on Foreign Relations. To take some of the commentary about the last panel about metrics that don't resonate and therefore drive change, and to take some of what you're talking about pragmatism and doing what you can given economic interests. Question whether things like property insurance and its unavailability or rising premiums, and/or corporations that have to, because they're going to incur financial losses, get clean audit opinions by saying what their activities are going to do, or get ratings agencies to mark them in a favorable way, that avoids politics. Are those, Ernie, drivers that could be leveraged to create more progress than we're now seeing through the political process?
Well, absolutely, and as I said, I mean, I would just to focus on the insurance example. Look, these are insurers and reinsurers who are just doing business. They're doing their calculations, and the reality is that they're going to lose a lot of money if they kept writing insurance in the same way. And it's gotten extreme so fast, where now we have so many homeowners in the United States, quotes, the nice term is self-insuring.
Not insured.
Not insured. And in fact, I'll just tell an anecdote, since I referred to it earlier, but I'll just say it. Until recently, my wife and I had a place way up high in the mountains and in the forest, and suddenly, after more than 20 years, we get a letter: your insurance coverage is over. We're out of the business. I said, okay. So I called the broker in the nearest town, 50 miles away, and I said, okay, well, you get me another insurer. She did. My $2,000 bill was proposed to go to $9,000. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, you got to pay attention to. So just as that one example on the insurance industry, I think this is going to be a huge driver. And it's not only coastal. Coastal, clearly, with sea level rise, I think Rafe mentioned that, is the issue. But for me, it was forest fires. Other places, it's drought, et cetera. Hurricanes, New Orleans, et cetera. So, so I think these real world, look, climate change is happening. Extreme weather is happening. It's going to get worse. And that is, I think, in the end, as I said earlier, going to be the regulator through people's pocketbooks. That's the reality.
We have a question in the middle. I'll come to you, sir, and then we'll go back for the next one.
Hi, Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. The soundbite that I really was struck by is that we love our grandkids, but we love ourselves more. Don't
forget children. We love our children, too.
Okay, yeah, and our children also. So at the National Association of Evangelicals, we've published a document called Loving the Least of These, which tries to get people interested in helping the poorest people in the world who are most impacted by climate. So I guess my question is, what kind of mix of self-interest and national interest and altruism and so on do you think would be most powerful in moving the climate solutions forward?
Well, I think it's a mixture. I mean, for example, I think the more global interest in, for example, especially addressing the underserved, ending energy poverty. For example, I think there's no doubt that there's a very strong philanthropic thrust in that direction, and so I think there's a mix. But I would say the reality is, in the end, the full solution is going to come not from philanthropists, not from national governments. I think it's got to be organizing huge amounts of private capital. And huge amounts of private capital, I think we are seeing some interesting developments towards, call it what you will, catalytic capital, somehow lowering the risk for some equity investor, let's say. But in the end, these are going to have to be bankable projects. Now, bankability will depend upon policy. For example, do you or do you not price carbon emissions, et cetera. But it also, again, I will be critical of all of us, that I don't think we've done a very good job in building the toolkit that will make projects, let's say in developing countries, really bankable. For example, we need a much more serious way of approaching carbon accounting. And it should not be a carbon accounting method developed to serve a policy. It should be a tool, just like financial accounting, that then gets applied to, in many, many different kind of contexts, in an affordable way, in an implementable way. Without that, how can you expect people to know what's bankable? How do you expect to have a carbon border adjustment without a system with real integrity in those tools? So the answer is, I think, we got to get private capital. When all is said and done, private capital has to flow, and we need to collectively do a better job in terms of providing the tools to allow that to happen.
Just to quickly follow on the question, private capital, huge amounts of private capital is the answer. To do what? Like specifically, what do you want private capital to do?
Well, for example, this may not be universally popular, but from where we are today, I think the old idea of allowing, let's say, companies in Europe, in the United States, to satisfy low carbon objectives by investing in real projects in the developing world, let's say, should be allowed, but it should be allowed only in a system in which you have a real way of counting, so that you know that it's real and not fake. And I don't think we're there. And we're talking about huge amounts of capital. I mean, the IEA has certainly estimated $2 to $3 trillion per year of additional capital. That's as much capital as the world generates for all investments across all sectors every year. How are you going to have that all focused on clean energy? Well, you're certainly not if you don't develop the toolkit to do it. Even then, it's going to be hard, obviously, but it's huge.
There was a young woman toward the back here with her hand up. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah Anderson at Seek Institute. I was wondering, you mentioned that regional parties and Congress play a big role in insulating climate change against the administration. I'm curious how you think they can do that now. Like, what is their role moving forward?
You mean like states?
States, regional parties, you said local and regional parties, so as broad or as narrow as you prefer.
Well, I think obviously there's a bit of a red state, blue state difference at the state level, but many states, many states have come forward, and I think they will continue to come forward. There will be challenges, like, for example, the issue around the California waiver, for example, in the EPA is a big contentious issue. The Senate parliamentarian just ruled that the Congressional Review Act cannot be used to remove that waiver. Whether that is going to happen, we will see. But I think there are going to be more fights of that type. But fundamentally, I don't see why states are not going to just keep pursuing the course that they've been doing. I think a more interesting question, in some sense, is whether the states where they are not pursuing those steps will try to put pressure on the large cities within their states that are trying to move out in climate, and did in Trump's first President Trump's first administration.
Is there a state you have in mind?
Texas would be an example, where you had big cities very much leaning forward, and we know there the state government in the investment sphere, in terms of where they allocate their capital, has put pressure on various investors. I don't see why they won't be putting pressure in the same way on some of the cities. And then it's a question of the mayors and the governors, having a little discussion, shall we say. Of course, in New York, not on energy, but in New York State, you've had a historic tension between New York City and the state government.
I'm going to exercise moderator prerogative and take the last question back for myself, because I suspect we will hear a lot throughout the day. We have already heard a lot about the worst case scenario for how, where did we land, Varun? Cataclysmic, is that where we landed? This could be
Apocalyptic gave
Apocalyptic,
way
we're not
to
going there.
cataclysmic, I think.
Give us hope. What gives you hope?
I
That
have,
when we reconvene 5-10 years from now and you're updating us with where things have landed, there may well be progress.
okay, first of all, let me say that, because you mentioned earlier that a discussion last year would have been different. I would have liked to have had the same discussion last year, actually. But now going forward, 5 years or 10 years, I think there is a huge hope in the innovation/cost reduction space. And in the end, cost reduction is going to be absolute. That's the affordability part. We're going to need cost reduction. We can't have e-fuels costing $20 a gallon and expect them to be used. We can't remove carbon from the atmosphere at $1,000 a ton, et cetera. So we're going to need that, and I think we will have it. There may be bumps in the road, but I think it's a secular trend that will continue, and that is extremely important. Maybe to end, Mary Louise, I'll give an imperfect example. If you look back at the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, this is to prove that Mike Froman was right in calling me his old friend. There had been a big debate throughout the 80s on acid rain and sulfur emissions. Now, a much narrower problem than carbon emissions, obviously. But there was a big debate. The science was there. The science wasn't there. The science kept, of course, making inroads on one side of the argument. And in 1990, I would say those who were objecting to new regulations to address acid rain kind of folded their hand very quickly, rushed to the negotiating table to capture as much rent as they could. But, and that's a well-known story, and that led to the Clean Air Act amendments, which got sulfur trading and all of that put in place. But I think there's another side of the story that's not emphasized enough, which is the analog to what we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Namely, in the 1980s, the Department of Energy was investing in the demonstration projects that by 1990 had established the economic baseline of what it would take to address that problem. Technology, cost reduction, I think, was a key enabler to allow the policymakers to reach their condominium. And I think we will see some of that right now. We are seeing it right now, I think, in climate. It's a much broader space, huge array of technologies. Some have already made it into the economic realm. Some have got a ways to go. But I think, 10 years from now, you're going to see a lot more population in that space of competitive costs. And then it's going to be a lot easier to move the policy. Are you personally hopeful, optimistic, given you have the long view? Yeah, I am. I'm not optimistic from the point of view that as we said earlier, we're clearly going to be in a realm of more extreme weather than we see today. It's going to cost us. We're going to have a lot more adaptation requirements. But fundamentally, bit slow, pace and scale, not what I would like. But, I've always said we should not confuse going as fast as we would like with going as fast as we can. And what I'm interested in is going as fast as we can, and on that I'm fairly optimistic. I'm about to release you all to coffee. I'm honor-bound to tell you to please be back in your seats at 2:45. We've got the next session coming up, Accelerating Clean Technology Innovation and U.S. Competitiveness. So I know we look forward to that. To all of you who joined us here and online, thank you. Secretary Bilo, Thank you.
Hi.
Cheers.